If you are a creative in the Philippines, be it a filmmaker, an artist, a game designer, just someone who creates stuff, then, and maybe you're just starting out, then there's something that you're going to eventually have to deal with, which is the colonial mentality of Filipinos. And what is that colonial mentality? It's that if it is created locally by Filipinos, instead of wanting to support that endeavor, Filipinos will generally think it is either of lower quality or it should be cheaper and cannot be priced at the same level as the international counterparts. So it's really hard to be a creative here in the Philippines. If you disagree with me, then continue watching and let's see if we're gonna eventually agree with each other. Because there are a lot of people who say, there's no such thing as colonial mentality. Um, if, and one thing I always hear is, if the work is of high quality, then we will support it also, just like the international counterparts. You usually hear this about films, right? If Filipino films were good, then we'd watch these Filipino films. But the thing is, a lot of independent Filipino films are award winning, and Filipino independent films are known around the world for, being award winning, having high quality. They've won awards in Cannes. Because of my disability and because of the pandemic, I haven't seen any movies lately, actually. But the last ones I've seen, so if you haven't seen, what did I watch? Ang Nawawala, Respeto, Norte by Lav Diaz. Those films were mind-blowingly good. Uh, yeah. Well, there was a film that did well here locally, which was General Luna. That did really well for a relatively independent film. It was marketed so well that it was able to go beyond the new normal colonial mentality that Filipinos have. But generally, the colonial mentality is a big factor on why Filipinos don't support our own creative endeavors. My own experience is as a game designer and developer, and unfortunately, I'm not able to really test if my games would do well abroad because many of them are based on IPs, intellectual properties that are local. So the context is so contextualized to the local. Like for example, like we made games on Darna, Elastic Man, and Bagani, the teleserye. So, a foreigner will really not appreciate it because they just wouldn't know what it's about. Although Bagani, our publisher did bring Bagani to a convention before in the US, and it was received okay. I mean, it was they found the game okay. It's just that the theme really they didn't understand it, so it wasn't sellable. But the gameplay was good. So this is something that we've had to deal with. Like just because it's made locally, Filipinos will automatically assume that it is worse or should be cheaper. So we go back to quality because that's what a lot of people say. Just make good quality goods. Just make quality films, quality comic books, quality games, and Filipinos will buy it. But there's two problems with that, okay? First is with quality comes with money, right? And with international projects, so Hollywood, Netflix, their market is the whole world. So the budgets that these creative projects have far dwarf what any local production can possibly get. So that's one factor, right? So you really have to also take it into context that production wise, budget wise, there is no way to really match the international um, projects. You can match them though in like ingenuity, storytelling, things that don't necessarily need budget. But the second part of it is that then if quality is such a big measure of if a product is worth buying, then why do Filipinos buy a lot of international garbage in a um, to in the lack of a better word? Because let's not pretend that the international creative projects don't release pretty bad products. I mean, let's take one big example would be the MCU, right? So how many people watched Age of Ultron in theaters here in the Philippines, right? If you watched Age of Ultron, which is considered like one of the worst MCU films, if you watched any of the MCU films which are considered rotten, and you haven't watched a award-winning Filipino independent film, then what's the deal? What's happening? I thought you said quality is the the measure. So why are you watching international garbage but you refuse or have not yet watched Filipino Gold? So that's a question to audiences, but for a Filipino creative, that's something that you have to understand. You have to understand why Filipinos would watch mediocre, bad films from abroad and not support golden films here. Because then that would mean that even if you create, as a creative, create the best, the best work ever, it doesn't mean Filipinos are going to support you. Sadly. Even if they say they will, even if they say quality is the measure, it's not. And that's what ticket sales show. Now I might sound like I'm being very critical of Filipinos. In a way I am. But I'm being descriptive, not prescriptive. I'm just describing the issue because creatives, especially if you're starting out, need to understand this. Because if you go into your creative work misunderstanding this, thinking that quality, if you just make something great, Filipinos will 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 support it, then you're going to be very disappointed when you've created something that's actually good and no one really supports you. That's just and that can very possibly happen. It's happened to like really big creatives. There are singers songwriters in the Philippines who leave the Philippines and make it big in America and somewhere else because they didn't get the support here. However, there is a disconnect because for Filipinos, it's not like they want to not support Filipinos, right? Filipinos want to support Filipinos, but they aren't supporting Filipinos. So what's happening? Why are Filipinos wanting to support Filipinos but they're just not doing it? And that goes back down to marketing and emotional attachment. So what people often don't realize is that the act of purchasing, the act of giving money for a product is an emotional choice. It's not an intellectual choice. So when you say I'm buying for quality, that sounds intellectual, but it's not the truth. People buy based on their emotions, based on what they want. Maybe they want to buy something that has quality or has the perception of quality. But that's not the biggest part of it. So you have to consider like the reason why most people are in Filipinos are into film, are into comics, are into all these creative stuff that they are into is because they have been consumers of a particular foreign brand. So for example, someone will say I'm a comic book reader, but actually what they're really saying is I'm a Marvel comic book reader. And they may not realize that, but they will only really read something from Marvel. If you show them an independent comic book, it's not gonna be interesting to them because in their subconscious, it's not really the reason why they read comic books. They read it because of Marvel. And that's the problem with colonial mentality is that we've grown up loving American and international media so much we have an emotional attachment to it while we don't have an emotional attachment to Filipino Creative works.